G'day guys, welcome back to True Footy. Today we are doing just the tips for round 18. Last week was a better round of tipping, or about the same. I think I got one wrong once again. The one I got wrong I think was a bit more forgivable than the previous week where I tipped Carlton. This week I tipped Fremantle to beat Sydney, and that was at least close. That was the only one I got wrong. Man, thank God I didn't get tempted to tip West Coast. Remember last week I was saying, let's give her a chance? Well, that looks fantastic now in hindsight. But we'll go through who did well in our various competitions, for which you can find the link in the description below if you still want to join. The winners of the week were joint winners in Will and Luke with 9 correct tips and a perfect margin. The only two people to get 9 out of 9 and the margin bang on. So well done, Will and Luke. Liam Mitchell is still leading the overall competition with 112. Fantastic going. I think Liam also got 9 out of 9, just not with the bang on margin this week. And the fantasy leader is once again Jaden Griffin, whose average is climbing, especially now that we're past the bye round. So well done, Jaden, on an average of 20.36. Before we get into it, make sure you guys have subscribed. We are gearing up for a big end to the 2025 season. Of course, we'll be continuing through the trade period and draft season as well. So we kick off the round with Carlton v Brisbane, which may have looked like a juicy encounter at the start of the year, but with the current form lines, it looks like a fairly one-sided battle, you'd think. I mean, are we still waiting for Carlton's response? I sort of gave up on that a couple of weeks ago when I tipped them to beat Port Adelaide and they got slaughtered. But this week against the Brisbane Lions, albeit at home, this is it's hard to imagine Carlton having too much of a chance, to be honest with you, with their most recent loss being against Collingwood, who are the benchmark of the competition, but it kind of underscored this period of poor form here for Carlton. They're kind of in dire straits, which could see them bounce back with a strong performance. I'm going to say that every week. But to be honest, they're playing the Brisbane Lions, who should be too strong, you would think. The Lions themselves, well, in addition to being second on the ladder, overcame plucky Port Adelaide. So to what extent do we think Brisbane could be vulnerable? I'm just trying to feed into the idea that this might be a good game. It could be. It could be. For some reason, when I think of this fixture, the first game that pops to mind is, was it a game in 2019 where Patrick Cripps went nuts and Carlton upset Brisbane? I can't remember the exact circumstance of that. Let me know in the comments. Was it David Teague's first game, or was it a game to potentially save his career? I can't really remember, but I remember it being significant, and I remember David Teague was involved. Unless it was Brendan Bolton. Forgive me, time flies. That's been 6 years now. Having said all that, Brisbane should win this game. They should, and I'll say by at least 26 points. This is where the tipping starts to get tougher. This is a tougher round than the last couple of weeks we've seen on this show and in this competition. We've seen a lot of one-sided fixtures, but now I think there's a glut of games in this round that are tough to pick, and I think it starts here with Gold Coast v Collingwood. Last time they met, Gold Coast actually got the chocolates over Collingwood, but Collingwood have obviously evolved from where they were last year to now where they're the benchmark of the competition. I keep using that phrase, but they're 14-2. Gold Coast last week, another mature 41-point win against a very depleted Essendon side, but they just keep getting the job done more or less when we expect them to, Gold Coast. So I see no reason to forecast performance here that's not going to be strong, particularly at home. So I suppose the question is, which version of Collingwood did they get? Every version we've seen of Collingwood this year, bar the opening round performance, has been really strong. So perhaps I phrased that poorly, but I would say that obviously when a team is so far in front of the rest of the competition, we might see a drop in performance. And if it comes this week, this is a bad week for it to happen, because I think the Gold Coast Suns are very tough to beat at Metricon Stadium. So I do think there's a chance the Gold Coast Suns upset them here. In fact, I might actually tip it. Collingwood were far too good for Carlton last week. They kind of coasted against West Coast, albeit they were kind of challenged as well with the way West Coast played, but not too many signs to suggest they're super vulnerable right now. I just feel like we might see Gold Coast really live for this game, and Collingwood are probably due for a loss. So I'm going to say Gold Coast win this by 7 points. The Bulldogs versus Adelaide at Marvel Stadium. I think this game was originally Ballarat, and they moved it so more fans could get to the game because it has become a hotly anticipated fixture. I, for one, am very intrigued to see how this game is going to go. These two sides haven't played at Marvel for a while. I think there's been some Ballarat games. I know last year Adelaide smashed the Bulldogs later in the year at Adelaide Oval. But on current form this year, both of these sides are flying. Look at their percentages, 133 to 138. Adelaide coming off a win against Melbourne, who were plucky, and Adelaide just a little bit too good. And the Bulldogs, again, were also challenged by North Melbourne for probably about half of that game before they really put their foot down and were able to create some distance on them. So it was a mature performance in a big match for North Melbourne, right? So it's a home game for the Dogs. Adelaide has been the better side this year, you'd have to say, and have probably claimed more scalps of top teams, or at least they've beaten Brisbane off the top of my head, whereas that's been the issue for the Bulldogs. This would be a big performance for them to try and prove that they can beat teams higher than them on the ladder, because that's the narrative at the moment. They're pumping the teams below them and haven't really claimed too many scalps in the teams above them. So having said all that, I do think at Marvel... Adelaide, there's no issue with Adelaide's performance in Victoria, certainly not this year off the top of my head. But over a number of years, I think they've been okay in Victoria. So that's not really a big question mark here. But I don't know. I think the Dogs might just take this one. I think it's a pretty 50-50 contest. If it was in Adelaide, I would definitely be dipping the Crows. But I'm going to say the Dogs win this. I feel myself like really rating the Dogs. It's not as though I don't rate Adelaide, but let's say it's a thriller and the Dogs win it by 3 points. GWS versus Geelong is another really tough one to tip. These two sides haven't met at NG Stadium for some time as well. I think it's been like twice since 2017, because it's either been at Manuka or more often than not, I think at GMHBA. The fun fact, the Giants have won 3 in a row at GMHBA. So that does kind of suggest there's some head-to-head form there where they can beat Geelong. They know how to beat Geelong. Hard to know what to take out of the Giants' massive win over West Coast. I thought West Coast was shocking in that game, even by their low standards. It was a really poor performance, and GWS kind of just mopped up after West Coast and killed them on counter-attack. So overall, there's still some question marks around GWS. They're 10-6. They're certainly one of the teams that are vying for the top 8. I mean, there's 9 now. But I still think there's been a big gap between their best and their worst. Their best can beat Geelong, but their worst would probably get slaughtered, to be honest, because they've had some losses at this ground this year. And as I'm saying that, I am talking myself into a Geelong tip. The Cats, again, by the same logic, it's hard to read too much into their most recent performance, but they've been a strong performer over the course of the year. And I think a pretty strong travelling side even this year. I know that they performed okay at the Gabba and lost, but then they beat the Crows at Adelaide Oval off the top of my head as well, and beat West Coast at Optus. So this all leads into, I don't really know who to tip once again. It's a tough fixture. Instinctively, I want to tip the home side here, because I think the Giants might have just started playing their best football over a somewhat decent amount of time now, or at least a few weeks in a row where we've seen it. And they know how to beat the Cats, and they probably would lift for this kind of occasion. But their home record this year concerns me. There's recent losses to the Power. There's a loss to Fremantle. There is a bad performance against Richmond in there, and perhaps one other I'm forgetting. But then they've also won at the Gabba this year, and I think they won at GMHBA. I think that was this year. Oh my God. I'm going to tip the Giants purely because, having said all that, I think they just know how to beat Geelong. And so I'm going to say that they win this game by 11 points. We should have a pretty good round here. Richmond v Essendon at the MCG on Saturday night, I think it is. This one is also not simple. I think Essendon is clearly better than Richmond, but I just saw today there's like 3 fresh injuries for Essendon. So their list situation is getting a little bit diabolical, and it could be at breaking point almost. But to this point, I don't think they've been particularly poor at any point. They've been competitive for patches of games, but ultimately not quite good enough to win games. And there's been a couple of blowouts, but it hasn't been a continued thing at Essendon. So Richmond got slaughtered by Geelong last week. What do you take out of that? Not much. We kind of knew that was going to come. And I think with a young side like Richmond, just because they get slaughtered one week doesn't mean that the next week they might not play well. That's just kind of the nature of, any side, but particularly young sides. I think Essendon could be vulnerable here. They could. And they were done by the Suns by 7 goals last week. Much tougher opponent than Richmond. But I guess it comes down to it, like, who's going to want it more in this game? Essendon kind of bleeding at the moment with injuries, and probably foreseeing a lack of opportunities to really claim too many wins for the rest of the year, I would have thought, given where the list is at. But that's also true for Richmond. They've got 2 winnable games from their perspective in a row, Essendon this week and then West Coast at Optus. So who lifts for this game? I'm going to tip Essendon, but I could absolutely see a surprise Richmond victory here, just because of the injuries. Another tough game to tip, and another one that is quite important in the context of settling the top 8 this year. Who's going to play finals? We know that Fremantle, with their most recent loss against the Swans, where it was a good game of footy, and they just couldn't nudge ahead. And Sydney won by 11 points or something like that in the end, maybe a little bit less. But the effect of that is that's now dropped them outside the top 8, and their percentage is weaker than any of the teams above them as well. So this is a huge game for Fremantle, and they are a fairly strong Optus Stadium side. I can't remember off the top of my head if they've lost at Optus this year, but they have beaten the Bulldogs there, and they've beaten Adelaide there. So I think they can lift for these home type games. Hawthorn, challenged by St Kilda at Marvel Stadium, no doubt, but probably not too much to get concerned about. Just the 3-goal win. And the week before that, they slaughtered a very young North Melbourne side. So nothing to be too concerned about. It's just a case of whether they're going to go to Optus and play their best brand of footy, because Fremantle can inhibit some teams sometime. Having said all that, I find myself a little bit unconvinced by Fremantle's current form. I mean, there's been a patch of wins there against some very ordinary sides where they just limped over the line, but that doesn't mean that that's their best football, that's their level. I find myself really conflicted with Fremantle. If anything, I've tipped them too much this year. I'm going to go with Hawthorn in this particular game. I'm going to say that they win by 15 points. I think Fremantle can win. I think the home Optus Stadium factor could be huge here, but I'll say Hawthorn by 15 points. Melbourne versus North Melbourne, two sides struggling, and this is actually kind of a big game, probably more so for North Melbourne in terms of trying to improve in terms of wins and losses. You know, Melbourne's season's a little bit cooked already, and they're still putting up a decent fight. Like against the Crows, I thought they were fairly valiant, albeit just not quite good enough. For North Melbourne, I think there is some value in them numerically, like improving their win-loss ledger. They have beaten the Demons earlier this year, so I think this could present as a really big and motivating game for North Melbourne, you'd think. That being said, like the last couple of weeks, they have been kind of battered. I mean, okay, that's probably not fair. Against Hawthorn, they were battered. Against the Bulldogs, they were pretty valiant for a half and played some decent footy, stretches of footy. I think Larky kicked 4 in the first quarter or something like that. Could have had 5 if my memory serves me there. And then after halftime, the Bulldogs were just too good. So we know that there's a big gap between North Melbourne's best and worst here. Their best can beat Melbourne by 50 points. Having said that, the Demons have come, maybe not a long way, but they've certainly improved significantly from the side that North Melbourne battered earlier this year. So with that all being said, I actually think Melbourne's going to win this game, to be honest. North Melbourne are still unpredictable, and there has been a big gap between their best and worst, like I've said, the last 2 weeks. A lot of inconsistency with this side, whereas I think maybe we know what we're going to get a little bit more with Melbourne. So I think North Melbourne can absolutely win this. And then we know they had a recent win at the G against Carlton, of course, but I think Melbourne's probably playing better footy than Carlton. So I'm going to say Melbourne win this by 21 points. St Kilda Sydney is also not simple. It's not simple. Sydney is 10th, St Kilda is 15th. St Kilda's most recent game was that performance against Hawthorn, where they went down by a few goals, and they're a pretty good Marvel side, which is a factor to consider here. Sydney, on the other hand, have they got their act together a little bit? There has been some recent good form. Like they beat the Power in Adelaide, which has been a bogey game for them a little bit, and the Power have played some decent footy around that. They beat Fremantle most recently. They've got some players back from injury, although Papley, I'm not sure what happened to him, but he definitely went off in the recent win over Fremantle. So I don't know where that sits exactly, but I think there has been some improved form here from Sydney, and I don't know if it's enough to really challenge for the top 8, given they haven't won enough games and the percentage is pretty average. But if they feel like they've got something to play for, I think they should win this game. I think St Kilda play well at this ground. We could see a really good game. We could even see a St Kilda win. But I think from what I saw from the Swans, it wasn't a great performance against Fremantle, but it was a pretty good one comparing to their lofty standards. I'll say Sydney win this by 10 points. But it's not an absolute gimme, this one. And here we go, upset of the round coming up. Port Adelaide versus West Coast at Adelaide Oval. Port Adelaide, again, I sort of just talked about them. I think there has been some compelling form, or at least improved form, in recent times, albeit they did go down by 4 or 5 goals against the Brisbane Lions, which honestly, that game was closer than I thought it was going to be. So I don't think there's too much reason to think Port Adelaide should be vulnerable against a travelling West Coast side who are not particularly good at this ground, or any other ground for that matter. On West Coast, I thought they took a massive step against Collingwood. And then I think, whether it was an adrenaline dump from, the first week of some media, maybe not praise, but some recognition in the media for the first time, West Coast just didn't live for that game. And whatever other people say, I think it was a step back for what West Coast has produced for a while now. I think it was a really bad performance. Could that incite some sort of motivation to get up and play this week? At the moment, it seems like West Coast are better away from home than at home. All this is just speculation on how big the margin's going to be, because I don't think there's really any chance Port Adelaide lose to West Coast. Let's go 40 points. I'd be surprised if it's any less than that. So there we have it. We have round 18 in the books according to my predictions. We have Collingwood, Brisbane, Hawthorn and Adelaide still in the top 4. We have Geelong down in 6th. Wow, so that's actually quite big if they lose to GWS here. And it would be significant for Fremantle as well, because that would put 4 points and 5% between the Giants and Fremantle. So Fremantle will be really hoping the Cats get the job done and go over the GWS Footy Club. Gold Coast also consolidate a top 7 spot with a surprise win over Collingwood. I know that I'm taking a bit of a leap with that one, but Collingwood can't win every game, and it's almost better if they do have a slump at some point, in my opinion. As an aside, Bulldogs up into 5th with a very healthy percentage, although they'll be even on points with Adelaide suddenly, with both sides having really strong percentages. Not sure what changes in the bottom half of the league there, other than we said there's probably a slight catching up between Sydney and Fremantle, and I suppose it's still possible Sydney make finals, but it seems very, very unlikely at this stage of the game. So yeah, other than that, not too much movement. As always, guys, let me know your game of the week and upset of the week. Game of the week, I think, for me is Adelaide and the Bulldogs. That's just personal preference. I think you could choose 5 or 6 games there that are going to be stunning. I suppose the upset of the week might be the Gold Coast Suns to beat Collingwood. I suppose that's my nomination. But there were so many 50-50s there. Like, North could beat Melbourne. St Kilda could probably beat Sydney. And Fremantle could certainly beat Hawthorn. I don't even know who's the favourite for that game. I presume Hawthorn. So a much tighter week to predict. But as always, I welcome your comments and your thoughts on the weekend ahead. Let me know what you reckon for upset of the round, etc. And I appreciate you guys watching. For now, I'll say goodbye. Cheers.